Hello and welcome back to the IPD Talks. I am Pouyan Kimiayjan, a research associate at IPD. In the IPD Talks, we aim to have in-depth conversations with experts on current foreign policy and national security issues facing Canada in the international order. Today, we'll be discussing Canada's middle power status within the current international order, and then talk about Canada-Russia relations. To discuss all this, we're joined by Dr. Zachary Paikin, who currently serves as a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and is also a non-resident research fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. We'll discuss his two recent articles for the IPD. The first piece, Is Canada Still a Middle Power?, explores Canada's geopolitical status in the emerging global order. The other piece, Revisiting Canada-Russia Relations, a New Paradigm for a Multipolar World, explores Canada-Russia ties and the need for a new comprehensive national strategy for Asia. I invite you to visit our website at peacediplomacy.org to review his recent analyses. You can find the link to the articles in the description of this video and or the audio version as well. Zach Paikin holds a BA in Middle Eastern Studies and Political Science from McGill University, a Master of Global Affairs degree from the University of Toronto's Monk School, and a PhD in International Relations from the University of Kent. Dr. Paikin is an expert with the Canada-Russia Research Initiative based at the University of Victoria and a collaborator with the Network for Strategic Analysis, a part of Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security MINDS program of the Department of National Defense of Canada. Additionally, he's an affiliated expert with the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations, as well as a member of the Cooperative Security Initiative, a project co-launched by GLOBSEC and Friedrich Ebert Foundation's Vienna office with the support of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. In 2001, he was invited to join the European Leadership Network's Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic security. Now, our first question will concern Dr. Paikin's first article on Canada's middle power status. My question is, in the emerging global order with the rise of certain powers in Asia and the decline of US hegemony, how can Canada best adjust to this new reality and secure its middle power status?
Well, thanks very much, Pouyan, for putting this together today. I think that the answer to your question is obviously a complex one because it's one of the central questions that Canada is going to be facing for the coming years, if not decades. But I think that step one is actually a psychological step more than anything else, right? It needs to be more than actually anything related to the material world. There needs to be a psychological internalization of where we are as a country right now, and perhaps an agreement between the various political elites, political parties in Canada on where we want to be over the long term. And that's got to start with an official recognition, not official in the sense of formal, but a significant fundamental recognition of the fact that we are no longer a middle power, right? So it's not about securing middle power status for us. It is about resecuring, if you will, middle power status. When you look at middle powers in today's world, if that term is still relevant at all, you think of France and Germany and Japan and countries like that do not make it into the big three, if you will, of the United States, China, and Russia. We are not in the same league as France or Germany or Japan, right? We are a member of the G7 as a mere formality, in effect, right? There's no question that we are as important an economy or as important a strategic player in global affairs or in geopolitical affairs more broadly as those other countries. So, that's got to be the number one realization, an acknowledgement that we actually no longer punch above our weight, as we like to say. And once we acknowledge that, then there might be a little bit more space in Canada's political discourse for long-term thinking of what we actually have to do.
Yeah, and in your most recent piece on the middle power issue, you advocate a more independent Canadian foreign policy that helps the country regain that middle power status, as you mentioned. However, amid increasing tensions between the United States and its strategic competitors in Asia, notably China and Russia, will there be room for Ottawa to adjust to this new independent, to adopt this new independent bipartisan, and I quote, long-term national strategy, end quote, despite opposition from Washington, especially when we look at the USMCA, known as NAFTA 2.0, when the Trump administration basically forced the non-market clause, which prevented Canadian ambitions for an eventual trade agreement with China. How can Canada pursue its own policy despite that opposition?
So this is a point that is constantly raised by people in Canada of, oh, we can't do X because look at how the United States will react. But there have been many examples in Canadian history of Canada going its own way and making its own decisions in foreign policy. In recent history, of course, the decision on the Iraq War, and it wasn't the end of the world. And there's a reason for that. Yes, going back to the mid-19th century, there has been a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that the United States is the preeminent power in North America. But that being said, we are more integrated economically into the United States than many other leading economies across the world, and that's because unlike market access agreements that were agreed between the United States and its various allies during the Cold War, those agreements had a geopolitical logic, right? Containment against the Soviet Union. This is what Peter Zeihan says. But we in Canada, having signed NAFTA, that was actually an agreement that had an economic logic, right? A purely economic logic rather than a geopolitical one. So that's, that explains part of the reason why our two economies are so intertwined, and that gives us some leverage. But our leverage is not just economic. It goes beyond that as well. We pose fundamentally because of our geography. We pose no threat to them, right? There's no way that there could ever be a staging ground for an attack on the United States coming from Canada. No one's talking about Canada joining, a rival alliance or anything like that, or challenging the Monroe Doctrine. But, simply because of that reality of geography, we have a little bit of, additional wiggle room or independence baked in there, right? And then beyond that, there's, the tacit acknowledgement of the fact that the United States is always going to view the defense of North America as tantamount to its own defense, to its own national security. And so whether we like it or not, the United States is going to defend North America. So we should be serious about, defending North America. But, beyond that, there is some wiggle room for us to conduct a more independent foreign policy. And the problem is, in recent decades, we've been just content to nurture our trading relationship with the United States and conduct an extremely US-centric foreign policy. And that has come at the expense of other pillars of our foreign policy, right? And that includes the multilateral dimension of our foreign policy, which was quite strong during the Cold War, but now we've lost two consecutive bids under two different governments in Canada, to serve on the UN Security Council. Again, other G7 members who are non-permanent members have not lost their bids. I'm thinking of Germany and Japan in particular, but also to a lesser extent Italy. We got to keep that in mind, right? That we're just not in that same league right now. And if we don't actually work to develop further wiggle room, then we're not going to be able to retake our place in the world where we can advance our own interests independently. And those interests are shifting because the global order is shifting. Now that doesn't mean we should just be trying to build back the old multilateral dimension of our foreign policy that we had during the Cold War. That's not coming back either, right? So we have to find a new equilibrium in our foreign policy that finds a way to balance between, on the one hand, nurturing our relationship with the United States, which will always be a key, strategic imperative for Canada, but also acknowledging the reality that we're in a shifting world and we have to adjust to those other shifting imperatives as well.
Yeah, and I want to build on that and move on to your other article on Canada-Russia relations. In this new context, when we look at Canada-Russia relations, how will this new emerging multipolar, global order impact bilateral relations between the two countries?
So that really depends on what happens over the coming 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? There are a lot of people out there, international relations realists, for example, who would say that, this is neo-realists, I should say, to be more specific, who would say that, the structure of the international order depends on the balance of power, and therefore that factor alone is going to structure the nature of relations between states. But I think that it goes beyond that. I think that ideas matter and norms matter, and irrespective of the balance of power, of course the balance of power matters, material factors matter, but there are also ideational factors that also matter. So the content, not just the structure of the order, but the content of the order matters as well. So even though the world is becoming more multipolar, and we're not in a multipolar order yet, but we're no longer in a unipolar order, that multipolar order could be an order rooted in zero-sum rivalry, or it could be rooted in various elements of overlapping cooperation and symbiosis between varying suborders, which could vary on an ideological level or on a regional level, etc. So it's up to us actually to shape the order. And that requires, excuse me, going back to this psychological dimension I was mentioning before, that requires us to acknowledge that we can be, if we build up the capacities of our own power in Canada, we can be a term setter. We can be a builder of international order rather than just a bystander. Now, unfortunately, based on the way that our foreign policy has gone in recent years and decades, we're not in that position right now. And rebuilding those foundations is going to take some time. But in order to do so, you can't be limiting your foreign policy options right now. You can't be making enemies of so many key actors, across the Eurasian supercontinent where, in all likelihood, much of the future of international order is going to be decided.
Now, let's dive deep into bilateral ties between Canada and Russia. With the arrest of Russian opposition leader Navalny and Russia's assertive posturing in eastern Ukraine, as we see the news these days, Western powers have responded with sanctions and harsher rhetoric. Will it be possible for Canada to navigate these grievances and still cooperate on issues of shared concern, or will these differences prevent any constructive engagement between the two sides?
So that's a key question, right? And I think that the answer lies in part in the nature of what has come to be known as the liberal international order. Liberal orders, to the extent that they have existed historically, have taken various different shapes, and some of their strongest proponents, including IR scholar John Eikenberry, acknowledges that liberal international orders can range from being thinner to thicker in terms of their institutions, in terms of the values that they promote, et cetera, et cetera. And so the liberal international order that has prevailed since the end of the Cold War has been much more rigid in its prescriptions than many of its liberal internationalist predecessors. It has featured a thick and robust set of institutions and norms, but not those that have been capable of adjusting themselves to other norms and other visions of international order. And so this connection in part as well between Western leadership and the liberal international order has made it very difficult to forge an order in which Russia and China and others can see themselves as equal powers in the overall international order. And so that has naturally driven a form over time of zero-sum conflict between the great powers, right? And so with the liberal order having been tied to US leadership throughout the Cold War, and then after the Cold War having been expanded into something with global aspirations, trying to create a liberal world order rather than just an international order in a very diverse world where it's very difficult to construct a liberal world order with a very a rigid set of prescriptions for what sort of values and reforms and institutions are necessary in today's world. That makes it very difficult for liberal and non-liberal powers to find ways to compartmentalize their disagreements and find ways to cooperate where they have shared interests, right? One key example of this is in the relations between the European Union and Russia, where there's natural symbiosis there, right? Where Russia provides the natural resources, and Europe provides finished goods, and Europe provides the economic clout, and Russia provides the security and military clout. So there's a natural symbiosis there, and yet despite the potential for strategic partnership, it has fallen into an alienation, if not a full-blown adversarial relationship. Again, that shows the extent to which ideas matter and norms matter, ideational factors matter, not just material factors. Because if only material factors mattered, then Europe and Russia would be getting along just fine based on the symbiosis that I just identified. But they're not getting along just fine. And so that makes it very hard as well for the similar reason for Canada and Russia to get along, because we're just so deeply tied to this US-led international order psychologically as well as empirically, right? And so part of what we need to do in Canada going forward is to have an honest discussion about the extent to which this so-called liberal international order is actually going to represent the future of world order writ large. And then we have to find some sort of new equilibrium in our foreign policy between, our liberal internationalist goals, which we retain, due to, not just, firm conviction, but also because it's in our interest to have, those liberal norms occupy a preeminent position in the global system, but at the same time acknowledge that there are alternative visions of order that exist that are becoming more and more important. And the future of international order in many ways will lie, I think, in finding a balance between those two things across the entire world. right? And so the countries that can actually get out in front of that and can find that equilibrium between those two things first are going to be the ones that are best positioned to succeed as the international order changes.
Yeah. And, in that same article, you argue that Canada and Russia have shared strategic interests. You mentioned that, quote, Ottawa and Moscow would prefer to avoid a zero-sum standoff between US and China, end quote. However, is there any room for, both bilateral and international cooperation between the two sides on helping cool the ongoing tensions between China and the United States?
So in theory, yes, right? In theory, yes, because you're already seeing things like that happen in today's world as it stands, right? I mean, ASEAN, for example, in Southeast Asia, has made it very clear that they're not going to be forced to choose between the United States and China. ASEAN exists precisely to limit, the ability of great powers to suck in, Southeast Asia into their own disputes, right? The European Union, despite major tensions in their relationship with China, having labeled China a systemic rival, having recently engaged in reciprocal sanctions that shocked a lot of people. Nonetheless, the economic relationship between the two will continue to deepen, and it looks as if they are still going to be moving forward, despite the predictions of many in the European think tank community. It looks like over the medium term, short to medium term, they will be moving forward towards implementing their comprehensive agreement on investment. So already you have these major economic blocs, the European Union and ASEAN, that have made it very clear that they don't want a world of rigid blocs, right? They don't want a world of iron curtains the way that we had during the Cold War. And so it's up for Canada again. It's up to Canada to realize that and actually to be able to do something there, right? But in many respects, the international order has baked into it certain measures that can inherently inhibit any trend towards the sort of rigid bipolarity that we're seeing right now. That doesn't mean that we will 100% avoid that bipolarity, particularly over the short to medium term, but there are some forces pushing back against it, right? And one of them is the presence of nuclear weapons, which ensures a multi-polar balance of power by definition. There are multiple holders of nuclear weapons in the world, and so there will be multipolarity by definition. Part of it are the patterns of globalization that allow many different blocs and powers around the world to mount their own economic rises. Part of it has to do with the nature of the robust institutions that we have today. Quite ironically, people attribute those institutions to the U.S.-led international order, liberal international order. But within the seeds of those institutions, when other powers, non-Western powers, adopt institutions like that, and we've seen that with China, for example, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, they can also, allow for a proliferation of multipolarity of a sort, if you will, in the institutional sense as well. So all of that is there. And so if we can actually, capture that in Canada as well and adopt a little bit more of an engaged, an ambitious, diplomacy that can come up with, creative new initiatives on this front, I don't see why we can't play a role, in limiting, at least in partnership with others. We can't do it on our own, of course. We don't have the clout to do it on our own, but in partnership with others who share our strategic interests to play a role in easing those great power tensions.
Yeah, now I want to move towards the Arctic theater, where both sides have vital interests in. Last week, the Russian government filed a submission to the UN requesting to extend a claim to the Arctic Ocean seabed. Now, these areas, if claimed, will border Canada's exclusive economic zone in the region. Critics warn that Russia already has a disproportionate military presence compared to Canada's in the Arctic, and will be effectively claiming the entire Canadian and Danish continental shelf as its own continental shelf. How can Canada respond to these developments, and how can the two sides come to a mutually beneficial arrangement that lessens tensions in the Arctic region?
Well, I mean, again, the key is not to view these developments in zero-sum terms, right? And if you read some, for example, of Elizabeth Buchanan's research on Russia's foreign policy aims in the Arctic, you'll note that some of them are geared towards preserving the status quo, right? Russia has an inherent interest in ensuring that the Arctic remains a stable theater through which it can export goods to the world. So we need to recognize that, and dialogue and mutual understanding can help us to recognize that. More than sort of Russian revanchism, which is obviously a concern. We should take it seriously and prepare accordingly. It's an important security concern. But more than that, when it comes to the Arctic in particular, I'm more worried about the impact that global great power rivalry, including with China, will have on the Arctic and our ability to continue insulating the Arctic region from geopolitical disputes that occur in other theaters, right? That's been one of the key successes of the Arctic Council since its creation in the mid-1990s. And we're already beginning to see, you know, that fall apart at this point in time. So that's where I think our focus needs to lie. It's on the global realm and what implications it has for the Arctic, you know, rather than you know, simply, you know, considering you know, per se, the Arctic to be a thing, you know, that is sui generis, which is ironic, right? Because you want the Arctic to remain insulated, but the only way to do that is to recognize the world as it is, right? Rather than as we would like it to be, right? So a lot of what we have to do in order to put together a cohesive grand strategy as a country is, ironically, to acknowledge the various differences that are occurring in terms of the norms and practices in each, you know, regional theater. And then weave all of that into some sort of coherent strategic whole. And we haven't begun to do that yet in Canada, I think.
Yeah. On that same note, can Canada and Russia bilaterally discuss and make progress on resolving shared areas of concern in the Arctic specifically, when there's really major tensions between the United States and Russia? In other words, can Canada forge its own Arctic policy without hindering relations with the United States, given that the US sees Russia as a serious military threat to its interests in the Arctic region?
Yeah, so there is you know, some wiggle room there, obviously. I mean, Canada's independent you know, push for the creation of the Arctic Council in the first place in the 1990s, you know, over objections from the United States, is part of what allowed the Arctic Council to be created. So there is, you know, a history of Canada's, you know, independent engagement there, but obviously the global geopolitical situation today is not as it was in the, you know, relatively benign 1990s, right? So, and furthering, you know, what would make this even more complex at this point in time is that, you know, the Arctic, you know, is to a certain extent an issue of continental security, right? So it's not just a question of, you know, Canada being a helpful fixer in helping to reduce great power tensions farther afield in like the Euro-Atlantic theater or in the Asia-Pacific theater. You know, the Arctic really is much more of Canada's, you know, sort of domestic remit, you know, continental security, and therefore, you know, we have to take it, you know, extremely seriously because it relates directly to how we're going to manage our relationship with the United States, and we have to tread very, very carefully there. It's a question of sovereignty for us, right? And so the key, you know, point that you know, I would just offer here is that we need to find some sort of way to simultaneously, on the one hand, pursue, you know, serious continental security cooperation with the United States, and on the other hand, you know, develop that wiggle room in again, you know, in theaters further afield, right? And you know, the way to do that is just to really hammer home this message that an independent Canada is actually going to be more of an asset to the United States than a liability more than anything else, right? We would be more of a liability if we are a strategic cripple than anything else, right? So if we're capable of talking to people and being helpful fixers in various different fora and regions across the world in ways that the United States can't necessarily do, then that's a huge asset to the United States, right? And peacekeeping during the Cold War was a clear, you know, example of that in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. So let's keep that in mind. The way we have to move forward here is, again, to know that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. It's going to take time to learn how to do that again, I think. But, you know, we have to be able to think about two things at the same time and actually, you know, conduct a nuanced, you know, strategy and foreign policy in that sense. But before we can even get there, you know, again, it goes back to these psychological issues, and it goes back to us being able to craft a strategic paradigm in the first place, which is part of the reason why our foreign policy is in such bad shape right now, is we just don't have that strategic overall paradigm or mentality to guide us. So that's where our reflections really need to move forward. And I think that we need a formal foreign policy review in order to do that, because the world has just changed so much, you know, over the more than 15 years since the last one was published.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a very insightful discussion. And with that, I would like to conclude today's episode of IPD Talks. I would like to thank you for your time and for the audience for joining us today. We were able to discuss Canada's middle power status, how it can regain it, and Canada's new approach towards Russia, and how it can forge its own independent foreign policy with respect to Asia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pouyan.